Captain Zex Nalar of the Crithian Empire had seen many worlds in his 40 cycles of service. Gas giants with floating cities, crystal worlds where beings of pure energy danced through prismatic canyons, ocean planets where whale-like creatures sang songs that could shatter starship hulls. But nothing had prepared him for the nightmare that was Sol 3, the world the primitive inhabitants called Earth. His ship, the Void Predator, hung in the outer atmosphere of this cursed planet, its shields constantly recalibrating to compensate for the insane electromagnetic storms that seemed to rage perpetually in the upper atmosphere. The gravity readings alone made his primary hearts skip beats, 1.2 times standard gravity. The atmospheric composition was a toxic mixture of nitrogen and oxygen that would burn the lungs of any civilized being. The weather patterns showed massive cyclonic storms that could level entire cities, and the geological surveys revealed tectonic activity that would classify this world as uninhabitable by any reasonable standard. Yet somehow, impossibly, the humans thrived here. Zex Nalar studied the data scrolling across his command console with the kind of horrified fascination one might reserve for watching a sun collapse. The dominant species, these humans, had not only survived on this death world, but had somehow managed to spread across its entire surface. They built their cities directly on fault lines, in the paths of regular storm systems, and even in regions where the local predators stood nearly 3 meters tall and possessed claws that could rend steel. The medical data was perhaps the most disturbing. Human bone density was nearly triple that of most spacefaring species. Their muscle fiber composition suggested they could generate force sufficient to crush Crithian skulls with their bare appendages. Their cardiovascular systems were designed to operate under gravitational stress that would kill most beings outright. Even their sleep cycles were adapted to a world where every dawn brought fresh dangers. "They are magnificent," whispered his science officer Veltan, her voice filled with the kind of awe typically reserved for natural disasters. "Look at these readouts, Captain. Their adrenal systems can flood their bodies with performance enhancers that would be considered military-grade stimulants in our pharmacology. Their pain tolerance exceeds our measurement capabilities." Zex Nalar nodded grimly. The Empire had discovered Earth through deep space scanning arrays, and the initial reports had dismissed it as another failed world, too violent, too unstable, too dangerous to support intelligent life. It was only when long-range sensors detected artificial energy signatures that scouts had been dispatched. The scouts had never returned. Follow-up expeditions had managed to observe from a safe distance, using stealth technology and staying well outside the planet's gravitational influence. What they discovered had sent shockwaves through Imperial High Command. Not only was Earth inhabited, but its inhabitants had achieved spaceflight despite evolving on a world that should have killed them all millions of years ago. The humans were a paradox that violated everything the Empire understood about evolution and civilization. They were simultaneously the most dangerous and most fascinating species ever encountered, which is exactly why the Emperor had ordered them collected. "Status report on the acquisition mission," Zex Nalar commanded. Lieutenant Grixvol manipulated his console with nervous efficiency. "The strike team has successfully penetrated the outer settlements, Captain. They've identified a suitable specimen in the agricultural zone designated Montana by the locals." The view screen shifted to show a real-time feed from the ground team's optical sensors. Zex Nalar found himself looking at a landscape that seemed designed by some malevolent deity. Vast stretches of cultivated land stretched to horizons that seemed impossibly far due to the planet's excessive size. Mountains rose in the distance like the spine of some sleeping titan. The sky was a brilliant blue that hurt to look at directly. And there, in the middle of this scene of barely controlled chaos, was a human settlement. The building was primitive by imperial standards, constructed from processed wood and metal, lacking any visible defensive capabilities or atmospheric processors. It was surrounded by what appeared to be livestock, massive quadrupeds that would have qualified as megafauna on any civilized world. The humans kept these creatures as if they were pets, but it was the small figure playing near the buildings that drew Zex Nalar's attention. A young human, barely past the larval stage by imperial calculations, was engaging in some kind of recreational activity with one of the smaller livestock. The child appeared to be attempting to mount the creature, an activity that would have resulted in immediate death on any sensible world. The specimen appears to be in the pre-adult phase, Grixvol reported. Age approximately 8 standard cycles according to our biological scanners. The capture should be straightforward. Zex Nalar watched as his ground team moved into position. They were using full environmental suits and powered armor, precautions that had seemed excessive when they departed the ship, but now seemed barely adequate. The team consisted of 6 Imperial Marines, each standing nearly 3 meters tall and equipped with enough firepower to level a small city, against one human child. The irony was not lost on him. The child was playing with what the database identified as a horse, an Earth creature that stood taller than most sentient species and possessed the muscle mass to kick through reinforced barriers. The young human was treating it like a plaything, laughing as the massive beast gently nuzzled against the child's diminutive form. "Beginning capture protocol," the team leader's voice crackled through the communication system. Zex Nalar watched as the Marines activated their paralysis fields and moved in on the settlement. The plan was simple: neutralize any adult humans with stun weapons, capture the child, and retreat to the extraction point. Standard procedure for collecting specimens from primitive worlds. The horses detected the approaching Marines first. Their acute senses, evolved on this nightmare world, immediately identified the aliens as threats. They began to display aggressive behavior patterns, but the Marines' armor was designed to withstand far worse than kicks from quadrupeds. The child looked up as the horses began to panic, confusion evident in the small face. Humans, despite their physical capabilities, were remarkably vulnerable in their early development phases. This one would be easy to capture. That's when the adult human appeared. Zex Nalar's breath caught in his throat as the figure emerged from the primitive dwelling. The human adult was massive by the standards of any species he'd encountered, easily 2 meters in height, with the kind of muscle development that spoke of a lifetime spent surviving on a death world. The figure was dressed in simple work clothing, but even at a distance, Zex Nalar could see the coiled power in those movements. "Sir," the team leader's voice was uncertain now. "We have an adult human approaching. Should we proceed with pacification?" Zex Nalar studied the figure on the screen. Something about the way the human moved set every survival instinct he'd evolved screaming warnings. This wasn't the shambling gait of a peaceful agricultural worker. This was the measured stride of a predator that had suddenly become aware of threats to its young. "Proceed with caution," Zex Nalar ordered. "Remember, these beings evolved on a world that would kill us in minutes. Do not underestimate them." The human adult, the database, identified the gender as male, called out something in the local language. The child responded, moving closer to the adult. The Marines were now within 50 meters of their targets. What happened next would be discussed in Imperial tactical academies for generations to come. The human adult somehow detected the Marines despite their stealth systems. Without warning, without any of the threat displays common to most species, the human simply acted. He moved faster than anything that size had any right to move. The first Marine had time to raise his weapon before the human was on him, hands that had been designed to grip tools now serving as weapons, capable of finding the precise weak points in armor that had been tested against plasma cannon. The Marine's scream cut across the communication channel as the human did something to his suit's joint mechanisms that caused the powered armor to lock up completely. Then the human was moving again, a blur of purposeful violence that spoke to millions of years of evolution on a world where hesitation meant death. "Open fire!" the team leader shouted, but the remaining Marines were hesitating. Their training had prepared them for dealing with primitive weapons, maybe simple projectile launchers. Nothing had prepared them for a creature that could move like liquid death and seemed to possess an instinctive understanding of their equipment's vulnerabilities. The second Marine managed to discharge his plasma rifle. The beam that could have melted through a starship's hull struck the ground where the human had been a fraction of a second before. The human was already inside the Marine's defensive perimeter, doing something to the weapon that caused it to discharge into the ground repeatedly. By the time the remaining 4 Marines had organized a proper firing solution, the human had systematically disabled 2 more of their number and was advancing on the rest with what could only be described as controlled fury. "Retreat to extraction point," the team leader ordered, abandoning all pretense of stealth or mission success. But the human wasn't finished. As the Marines attempted to withdraw, the human did something that defied everything the Empire understood about primitive species. He began using his environment as a weapon system. Rocks became projectiles with enough force to crack armor plating. A simple farming tool, wielded with the kind of precision that spoke to predatory instincts, became capable of disabling advanced technology. The team leader managed to get off one more communication before his suit's systems went dark. "The child! He's protecting the child!" The view screen went black as the last Marine's camera feed was cut. In the silence that followed, Zex Nalar found himself staring at a blank screen and trying to process what he'd just witnessed. 6 Imperial Marines, armed with enough firepower to pacify a small city, had been systematically neutralized by a single human using nothing but his bare hands and farming equipment. The human hadn't been trying to kill them. The Marines' vital signs indicated they were alive, merely incapacitated. But the message was clear. The child was not available for collection. "Sir?" Veltan's voice was barely a whisper. "What are your orders?" Zexnala realized that his primary hearts were beating so fast he was approaching cardiac failure. Every instinct he'd evolved was telling him to flee, to put as much distance between his ship and this insane world as possible. But the Emperor had given specific orders. The human child was to be collected for study, regardless of the cost. "Prepare orbital bombardment," he heard himself say. "If we cannot take the child, we'll remove the threat." But even as he gave the order, Zexnalar found himself wondering if they were making a terrible mistake. The human adult had disabled 6 Marines without killing them, a restraint that spoke to intelligence and tactical thinking. What would happen when that restraint was removed? What would happen when they gave this Deathworld predator a reason to hunt them? The targeting systems came online, painting the primitive settlement with enough firepower to glass the entire valley. But as Zexnalar watched the coordinates lock in, he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't eliminating a threat. They were creating one. The orbital bombardment lasted exactly 17 seconds. For 17 seconds, the Void Predator rained down enough concentrated plasma energy to sterilize a continent. The primitive settlement simply ceased to exist, along with everything within a 10-kilometer radius. What had been rolling farmland and wooden buildings was now a glass crater that would remain radioactive for the next 1,000 years. Captain Zex Nalar watched the tactical display confirm mission completion. All heat signatures in the target zone had been eliminated. The threat was neutralized. So why did he still feel like prey? "Sir," Communications Officer Hel Zin's voice was tight with confusion. "We're receiving a transmission from the planet's surface." "Impossible!" Zex Nalar's secondary heart skipped. All life signs in the target area were eliminated. "The transmission is coming from outside the bombardment zone, sir. Approximately 100 kilometers to the east. It's being broadcast on our encrypted military frequency." The bridge fell silent. Their encrypted frequencies were changed hourly, using algorithms that would take a primitive civilization centuries to crack. Yet somehow, someone on the planet's surface was using their own communication protocols against them. "Put it through," Zex Nalar ordered, his voice barely steady. The main view screen flickered to life, and every being on the bridge felt their blood freeze in their veins. The human adult from the settlement was staring back at them, his face a mask of cold fury that transcended language barriers. Behind him, the small child sat safely in what appeared to be some kind of underground shelter. They had survived. Somehow, impossibly, they had detected the orbital bombardment early enough to reach safety. The human spoke, and the translation software struggled to process the emotional undertones in his voice. When the artificial voice finally emerged from the speakers, it carried a weight that made veteran soldiers flinch. "You tried to murder my daughter." 5 words. 5 simple words that somehow conveyed a depth of rage that Zex Nalar had never encountered in 40 cycles of military service. The human continued speaking, his voice never rising above conversational level, but every word seemed to pierce through the ship's hull like a blade. "I don't know who you are or where you came from. I don't care about your technology or your empire or whatever reason you thought justified trying to kill a child. I only care about one thing now." The image zoomed out slightly, revealing more of the shelter. It wasn't just a simple bunker. The walls were lined with equipment that shouldn't exist on a primitive world. Communications arrays that could reach across star systems. Computer systems that seemed to be actively interfacing with Imperial networks. Weapons that looked suspiciously advanced for a species that was supposed to be in the early stages of spaceflight. "My name is Marcus Chen," the human said, each word delivered with the precision of a weapons lock. "I am a former systems engineer for the Earth Defense Consortium. I retired to this farm to give my daughter a peaceful childhood away from the war." "War?" Zex Nalar felt his world shift slightly. What war? Earth was supposed to be an isolated world, barely aware of the greater galaxy. Marcus Chen smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Zex Nalar had ever seen. It was the smile of a predator that had just realized its prey was exactly where it wanted it. "Congratulations," Marcus said softly. "You just made this personal." The transmission cut off. For a long moment, the bridge remained silent. Then alarms began blaring throughout the ship as every sensor array simultaneously detected massive energy signatures emerging from the planet's surface. "Report!" Zex Nalar shouted over the noise. Veltan's voice was barely controlled panic. "Captain, I'm reading launch signatures across the entire continental mass. Hundreds of them. The primitives. They have a space fleet." The main screen shifted to tactical display, and Zex Nalar watched in growing horror as red dots began appearing across Earth's surface. Launch sites that had been invisible to their deep space scans were suddenly active, sending ship after ship into orbit with impossible speed and efficiency. "Those aren't primitive vessels," Grixvol reported, his voice cracking. "I'm reading fusion drives, antimatter reactors, and weapon signatures that match or exceed our own technology levels." How? How had the Empire's intelligence been so catastrophically wrong? The answer came as Earth's communication network suddenly opened up to Imperial scanning. What they found made Zex Nalar's worst fears seem optimistic by comparison. Earth wasn't an isolated primitive world. Earth was the homeworld of a species that had been fighting a galactic war for the past 50 years. The humans had been battling a machine intelligence known as the Void Swarm across 12 star systems, developing weapons and tactics that made Imperial technology look like children's toys. The agricultural settlements were military bases. The primitive technology was camouflaged infrastructure designed to be invisible to exactly the kind of scanning arrays the Empire used. The early spaceflight capabilities included faster-than-light drives that could outrun anything in the Imperial fleet. Humanity wasn't a primitive species waiting to be studied. They were a warrior race that had been preparing for exactly this kind of encounter for decades. And Zex Nalar had just tried to murder one of their children. "Incoming transmission," Hel Zin announced, her voice barely a whisper. This time it wasn't Marcus Chen. The human on the screen wore a military uniform that suggested command authority, and her expression made the farmer's anger look gentle by comparison. "This is Admiral Sarah Mackenzie, commander of Earth Defense Consortium forces." Her voice carried the kind of authority that could order the destruction of star systems. "You have exactly 1 minute to explain why you just attempted to murder civilians on a protected world." Zex Nalar found his voice with difficulty. "I am Captain Zex Nalar of the Crithian Empire. We were conducting a scientific survey. You were conducting a kidnapping operation followed by an attempted orbital bombardment," Admiral Mackenzie interrupted. "We have full recordings of your activities, including your Marines' assault on the Chen family. You have 45 seconds to justify why Earth Defense Forces shouldn't treat this as an act of war." The tactical display updated again. Earth's fleet was emerging from stealth positions throughout the system. Dozens of ships, each one larger and more heavily armed than the Void Predator, were moving into attack formations with a coordination that spoke to centuries of military experience. Zex Nalar realized that his ship wasn't just outnumbered. They were surrounded by a force that had been watching them since the moment they entered the system, probably analyzing every component of Imperial technology and developing countermeasures in real time. "Admiral Mackenzie," he began, trying to keep his voice steady, "the Empire had no knowledge of Earth's true capabilities. We believed you were a primitive species requiring guidance. 30 seconds, Captain." On the tactical display, weapons systems across the human fleet began powering up. Energy signatures that made Imperial plasma cannons look like flashlights started appearing throughout the formation. And then Marcus Chen's voice cut through the military frequency, cold and implacable. "Admiral, they tried to kill Sarah. They glassed our home. I want them to understand what they've done." "Understood, Marcus. Captain Zex Nalar, you're about to receive a lesson in human military doctrine. We call it disproportionate response. The concept is simple. When someone threatens our children, we don't just neutralize the threat. We eliminate every trace of it so thoroughly that the story becomes a cautionary tale for the next 1,000 years. The first human ship to reach firing range was a vessel the database identified as a Retribution-class dreadnought. It was roughly the same mass as the Void Predator, but every line of its construction spoke to a design philosophy focused on one thing: killing enemies as efficiently as possible. "Locking target solutions," the human weapons officer announced over the open channel. "All ships prepare for synchronized barrage." Zex Nalar realized that his entire understanding of the galaxy had been wrong. Humans weren't primitives to be studied or specimens to be collected. They were apex predators who had spent generations perfecting the art of warfare, and his empire had just declared war on them by threatening their young. "Wait," he called out. "Please, we can negotiate terms. The time for negotiation ended when you fired on my daughter." Marcus Chen's voice cut through every other signal, somehow reaching the bridge directly despite their sophisticated communications encryption. "You wanted to see what a human can do when they're truly angry? Congratulations! You're about to find out." The human fleet opened fire. What followed couldn't properly be called a battle. It was more like a demonstration of technologies that the Empire didn't know existed. Weapons that could bend space-time to redirect energy attacks, shields that seemed to absorb incoming fire and convert it to additional power. Targeting systems that could predict evasive maneuvers before they were made. The Void Predator's weapons couldn't even lock onto the human ships. Their drives moved them through space in patterns that violated physics, as Zex Nalar understood it. When Imperial plasma beams struck human shields, the energy was somehow captured and redirected back at its source. Within minutes, every system on the Void Predator was disabled. Not destroyed. Disabled with surgical precision that left the crew alive, but the ship completely helpless. "Attention, Imperial vessel!" Admiral Mackenzie's voice came through the emergency communications array. "You are now a prisoner of Earth Defense Forces. You will be escorted to Luna Station for processing. Resist, and we will demonstrate why humanity earned the nickname Deathworld Predators from every species we've encountered." As human ships moved into boarding formation around his crippled vessel, Zex Nalar found himself thinking about the intelligence reports that had brought them here. Earth was supposed to be an isolated world full of primitives. Instead, they had stumbled into the territory of a spacefaring empire that made his own civilization look like children playing with toys. But the most terrifying realization came when he remembered Marcus Chen's final words. "You wanted to see what a human can do when they're truly angry." This wasn't what humans looked like when they were angry. This was what humans looked like when they were being restrained, professional, and merciful. He had a feeling that the Crethian Empire was about to learn the difference. Luna Station was not what Captain Zex Nalar had expected from a primitive civilization. The orbital facility stretched across hundreds of kilometers of space, its massive structure incorporating defensive systems that could have held off entire Imperial battle fleets. Docking bays designed for ships 3 times the size of anything in the Crethian Navy. Manufacturing centers that were apparently producing antimatter by the ton. And defense grids that made Imperial Fortress worlds look poorly protected. As the Void Predator was tractored into a holding bay, Zex Nalar found himself staring at a civilization that had somehow managed to remain hidden from galactic awareness for decades while building technology that surpassed anything the Empire had ever encountered. The humans hadn't just been camouflaging their capabilities, they had been actively deceiving every spacefaring civilization in the galaxy about their true nature. "Sir," Veltan whispered from her station. "The energy readings from this station alone exceed the total output of our home system. How is this possible?" The question was answered when Admiral Mackenzie's voice came through their communication system one final time before they were boarded. "Captain Zex Nalar, before our people take you into custody, I want you to understand exactly what your empire has stumbled into." The main view screen activated, showing a tactical display that made Zex Nalar's worst fears seem optimistic. The map revealed human colonies across dozens of star systems, each one defended by fleets that dwarfed Imperial forces. Trade routes that spanned entire galactic arms. Industrial facilities that could produce war materiel on scales that defied comprehension. "Humanity has been spacefaring for over 200 years, Admiral Mackenzie continued. "We've been fighting the Void Swarm for 50 of those years across 12 systems, developing weapons and tactics specifically designed to counter technologically superior enemies. We've been monitoring galactic civilization for decades, studying every major power and preparing for the day we might need to defend ourselves against them." The display zoomed in on a particular region of space, marked in red. "The Crethian Empire. Population, 12 billion across 6 core worlds. Military strength, approximately 2,000 ships of various classes. Industrial capacity, minimal by galactic standards. Threat assessment, negligible under normal circumstances." Zex Nalar felt his world crumble as the human admiral continued her briefing. "Your empire's expansion has brought you into contact with 17 different species over the past century. Your standard protocol involves identifying primitive worlds, conducting specimen collection operations, and eventually annexing territories that show resource potential. It's a strategy that works well against genuinely primitive civilizations." The tactical display shifted to show real-time intelligence on Crethian space, fleet positions, colony locations, resource centers, information that should have been impossible for outsiders to obtain. Unfortunately for your empire, Earth is not a primitive civilization. We are a military power that has spent generations preparing for exactly this scenario. And you just gave us cause to demonstrate why the rest of the galaxy has learned to leave Deathworld predators alone. The screen went black for a moment, then showed a single image that made Zex Nalar's blood freeze in his veins. It was Marcus Chen, still in his farming clothes, but now standing in what was clearly a military command center. Banks of monitors showed real-time surveillance of Crithian space. Weapons systems that could reach across star systems. Intelligence networks that had apparently been watching the Empire for years. Captain Zex Nalar. Marcus Chen's voice was calm now, but carried a weight that made admirals sound like children. You tried to kidnap my 8-year-old daughter. When that failed, you tried to murder her with orbital bombardment. In human culture, there is no crime more serious than harming children, and there is no response more inevitable than what's about to happen to your empire. The image shifted to show Earth's orbital defenses fully deploying for the first time in decades. Weapons platforms that had been disguised as asteroid mining stations revealed themselves as mobile battle stations. Stealth ships, decloaked throughout human space, their numbers suggesting an industrial capacity that dwarfed anything the Empire had imagined possible. Sarah is my daughter, Marcus continued, but every child in human space is under our protection. When you threatened one, you threatened all of them. That makes this personal for every human citizen, every military unit, and every government official in our civilization. Admiral Mackenzie's voice returned. Captain, your emperor ordered the collection of human children for study. Your intelligence services classified Earth as a primitive world suitable for exploitation. Your military conducted an assault on civilians followed by an attempted genocide. Under human law, these actions constitute crimes against humanity. The consequences became clear as the tactical display updated in real time. Human fleets were moving throughout the galaxy, their faster-than-light drives allowing them to appear anywhere within days. Ships that had been observing Crithian colonies for years were now revealing themselves. Their presence suggesting that human intelligence had been watching the Empire far longer than anyone had realized. The Earth Defense Consortium has voted unanimously to respond to Crithian aggression, Admiral Mackenzie announced. Effective immediately, the Crithian Empire is designated a hostile power. All Crithian vessels will be intercepted and disabled. All Crithian colonies will be quarantined. All Crithian military assets will be neutralized. But Marcus Chen wasn't finished. Admiral, if I may, I'd like to explain to the captain what personal means in human terms. The screen showed live feeds from across Crithian space. Human ships were already in position around every major Imperial installation, not attacking, simply present, their weapons trained on targets that couldn't effectively fight back. Captain, your species evolved on a garden world with minimal predators and abundant resources. You developed civilization through cooperation and expansion, encountering weaker species that couldn't effectively resist your technological advantages. It's a perfectly reasonable way to build an empire. Marcus Chen's smile appeared again, and Zex Nalar realized that the human was no longer angry. He was something far worse. He was coldly, calculatingly determined. Humans evolved on a death world where everything wanted to kill us. We developed civilization through warfare, competition, and the absolute necessity of protecting our young from threats that could end our species. When someone threatens our children, we don't just fight back. We ensure that the threat never exists again. The tactical display began showing projections of human military doctrine applied to Imperial space. Not invasion, systematic dismantling. Colonial populations relocated to safer worlds. Military forces disabled and impounded. Government structures replaced with human administration until the Empire could demonstrate that it no longer posed a threat to children anywhere in the galaxy. Your empire spans 6 star systems, Marcus continued. Impressive by local standards. Humanity spans 67 star systems, with industrial capabilities you can't imagine, and military technologies you can't counter. We've been preparing for this kind of conflict since before your species achieved spaceflight. Admiral Mackenzie's voice cut in with the final details. Captain Zex Naylor, you will be returned to Crithian space to deliver this message to your Emperor. The Empire has 72 hours to surrender unconditionally and submit to human oversight. Any resistance will be interpreted as continued hostility toward human children and will be met with escalating force. The screen shifted to show what escalating force meant in human terms. Weapons capable of destabilizing stars, ships that could move through folded space to appear anywhere in the galaxy instantaneously, industrial facilities that could produce war fleets faster than enemies could destroy them. If your Emperor chooses to resist, Marcus Chen said quietly, he will discover what happens when Deathworld predators stop being restrained by civilization. We will dismantle your empire ship by ship, system by system, until nothing remains but a cautionary tale told to species who might consider threatening our young. The boarding parties arrived while Zex Nalar was still processing the scope of human capabilities. The soldiers who entered his bridge were not the towering warriors he'd expected, but normal-sized beings in advanced armor who moved with the kind of casual competence that spoke to extensive combat experience. Captain Zex Nalar, the team leader announced, I'm Sergeant Martinez, Earth Defense Marines. You and your crew will be transported to Luna Station for medical evaluation and debriefing, then return to your empire with Admiral Mackenzie's message. As the Marines efficiently secured the bridge, Zex Nalar found himself studying their equipment. The armor was clearly designed by a species that understood warfare on a level the Empire had never achieved. The weapons were compact, but showed energy signatures that exceeded Imperial heavy ordnance. Even their movements showed training that assumed combat against technologically superior enemies. Sergeant, he managed to ask, how long has humanity been preparing for this kind of conflict? Sergeant Martinez paused in his work, considering the question. Sir, humanity has been preparing for alien invasion since we first looked at the stars and realized we weren't alone. Every human child grows up learning that the galaxy is a dangerous place and that we might someday need to defend our species from threats we couldn't imagine. The Marine gestured toward a viewport showing Earth in the distance. Your species developed on a garden world, so you think of space as an environment to be explored and colonized. We developed on a death world, so we think of space as a battlefield where the survival of our children depends on our ability to outfight anything we encounter. As the Void Predator was prepared for its return journey to Imperial space, Zex Nalar found himself thinking about the message he would have to deliver to the Emperor. The Crithian Empire had achieved its position through technological superiority and the conquest of weaker species. They had never encountered a civilization that was not only more advanced, but had been specifically preparing to fight exactly the kind of war the Empire was designed to win. Worse, they had made it personal by threatening a human child. From what he'd seen of human psychology and military doctrine that guaranteed the kind of response that would be remembered across the galaxy for millennia to come. Sergeant Martinez, Zex Nalar asked as his bridge was returned to Imperial control, what happens if my Emperor refuses to surrender? The Marine's expression was hidden behind his helmet, but his voice carried the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had seen warfare on scales that most species couldn't comprehend. Sir, in that case, you'll find out why every other major power in the galaxy has spent the last 50 years very carefully avoiding any action that might give humanity a reason to consider them a threat to human children. Your Emperor ordered the kidnapping and attempted murder of an 8-year-old girl. In human terms, that's not just an act of war. The Marine paused as he sealed the last of the security protocols. It's an extinction-level mistake. As the Void Predator began its journey back to Crithian space, carrying the Admiral's ultimatum and the promise of consequences beyond anything the Empire had ever imagined, Captain Zex Nalar found himself hoping that his emperor would choose wisdom over pride. Because he had seen what angry humans could do when they were being restrained and professional, he had no desire to discover what they would do when the restraints came off.